Welcome to the Veritas Podcast, the weekly show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church. Welcome to the Veritas Podcast. I'm Robert Kassman, and I'm joined, as always, by Robert Sisko. This is a show where we delve deep into a papal writing and study it. This sprang from an idea that Rob and I had to form a study group of sorts of papal encyclicals. If you're a listener, you can email us at veritaspodcast@yahoo.com. You can also comment on our blog at veritaspodcast.blogspot.com. We're also on iTunes and other mini podcatchers, as well as sites like Gloria TV. The encyclical that we'll be looking at for the next 15 or so episodes is Pascendi Gregis on the Doctrine of Modernists. It was written by Pope Pius X on September 8th, 1907. Feeding the Lord's Flock is a really good book that attempts to bring Pascendi down to the everyday man's language. I will use that occasionally as a source. Before going further into it, it's helpful to understand what the word modernist even means. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, quote, etymologically, modernism means an exaggerated love of what is modern, an infatuation for modern ideas, the abuse of what is modern. According to Alice von Hildebrand, modernism, quote, refers to the notion that a fully modern man has been forever changed by science so that he will not accept only what he can observe by way of experiment through the scientific method, empirical evidence. He must not put his faith in anything outside of measurable and observable phenomena, and this means the modern man must no longer look at life and religion like the men of old. As a result of this attitude, the modern man dismisses scholastic philosophy because it exposes and roots out the errors found in modernist thinking. This is why modernists seek out philosophers who embrace modernisms. These men believe that all doctrines and dogmas of the Church are to be harmonized with science. In turn, the use of scientific method to judge history itself is employed. They make science the absolute standard as they go about telling us that all the historical claims of the miraculous and the divine cannot be proven by the scientific method. Therefore, they conclude all that is associated with the miraculous and the divine must be removed from Scripture. End of quote. Rob, it might be helpful to kind of bring back what we discussed in our previous series on Libertas to this discussion of Pascendi, and I think there's a bridge there to be found between the evolution from naturalism, rationalism, and, of course, liberalism to what we're going to be studying this time, modernism. Can you kind of give us a pretty good overview of those and how they're connected?
Yes, and these errors, they're interconnected, and they lead logically from one error to the next error to the next error, and then we finally get to modernism. So we'll begin with naturalism. Naturalism is, Father Fahey defined naturalism as anti-supernaturalism. So it's a error that denies the supernatural order. It does it in one of two ways. Either it will deny the very existence of God, that would be atheism, or it will concede that God does exist, but it will deny that there's any intervention of God, of the supernatural, in the natural order. Now, for the version that does concede the existence of God, but denies any intervention of God in the natural order, that version will sometimes affirm the natural laws. They'll say, yeah, God does exist up there in heaven, and He established the laws of nature, gravity, all the laws of nature, but He doesn't intervene over and above that. And that version of naturalism is called deism. Deists, they affirm one truth. They affirm the truth that God has established the laws of nature, but then they deny that He intervenes in the affairs of man. So naturalism denies whichever version, either the version that doesn't believe in God or the version that does concede the existence of God. On the practical level, it's the same. They both deny that God intervenes in the affairs of man. And there's consequences that follow upon this. One, if God does not intervene in the affairs of man, it means Jesus wasn't God because Jesus was in the natural order. It means there's no sanctifying grace, no supernatural life for the soul. Okay? So that means then you just have to live a good natural life. That's good enough. It denies any miracles, because miracles are a supernatural act in the natural order. And it also denies divine public revelation, because divine revelation is revelation from the supernatural order to the natural order. So those are some of the consequences that flow from the foundational error of naturalism. Now, rationalism is the application of naturalism to human reason, and liberalism is the application of naturalism to the human will. So what does that mean? Rationalism is the application of naturalism to the human reason. That means if there's no divine revelation for man to adhere to, that means then that the human reason is the sole principle of truth. It's the sole judge of right and wrong. Okay? So rationalism claims that. It claims the supremacy of human reason. It denies divine revelation, claims that human reason is supreme. It's the sole judge of right and wrong. It's the sole principle of truth. That's rationalism. Liberalism? Liberalism is the application of naturalism to the human will. That means that the human will is supreme. Naturalism denies divine revelation. Rationalism denies that man must adhere to the truths God has revealed. There are no truths, rationalism would say, that God has revealed. And then liberalism says we don't have to obey any truths God has revealed because we don't think He's revealed any truths. So the human will is supreme. Whatever I will to do, whatever I think is best is what I should do. Forget about any divine revelation. And whatever society wills and thinks is best is what society does. Society should do. So it excludes God from the picture. Now, so that is then naturalism, rationalism, and liberalism. Now, these logically lead then to modernism. Modernism, we referred to it in our study on Veritas as the religious offspring of naturalism, or the religious offspring of rationalism. Rationalism says human reason is a sole principle and source of truth. Well, modernism says human reason is the principle and source of religious truth and of religion and of divine revelation. See, it divinizes man. Modernism will not explicitly deny divine revelation like rationalism will. Instead, it will say, okay, there is a divine revelation, but divine revelation is my reason. See, it makes the reason divine. And it does this by what they call vital imminence, which is, it blurs the distinction between the natural order and the supernatural order by saying that the divine is within man. All men have this divine within, and so all religion then comes from within man, from this divine within man. All right? Now, this is how the modernists will explain religion itself. Okay? Remember, it starts from within. It comes from within man. Before we do that, what is faith? Faith is an intellectual assent to the truth revealed by God. So God has revealed truths to us through public revelation. Man then assents to these truths by the use of the virtue of faith, which is within his intellect. He assents to these truths, and he makes an act of faith. That's faith. For the modernist, that's not faith. For the modernist, faith, everything comes from within, truth comes from within, and religion comes from within. So this is how they say religion originates. It begins, they say, within man with a need for the divine. So man has this, he has a need for something more, okay? This need for the divine, it produces a movement of the heart, a sentiment or an affection of the heart, okay? So we have a need for God, and this need for God, it produces a feeling, a warm, fuzzy feeling in our heart, okay? That's what they call faith. The warm, fuzzy feeling in the heart, that comes from this need for the divine, that's what a modernist calls faith, okay? And they say then that faith, that warm, fuzzy feeling in the heart, that sentiment of the heart, they say that is God. That warm, fuzzy is God, okay? And that warm, fuzzy is also, they say, the source of divine revelation.
You're right when you speak, though, about sentiment becoming God in the modernist size. This idea of the senses being of vital importance to the modernist was discussed in the preface episode as well, but if it's a warm, fuzzy feeling, if it's an emotion, then as it can come, it can also go, right?
Right. But yet for them, that warm and fuzzy, that's God. And that warm and fuzzy, that's also the faith. And that warm and fuzzy, that's also the source of divine revelation. Okay? Now, they say that this need for the divine, this warm, fuzzy, all this is produced within man only in certain circumstances. So we need to then arrange these circumstances that will then so-called awaken this divine within. Okay, so everything comes from within. Everything is within man. It's based on man, okay? But they say it's based on God because they blur the distinction between the natural and supernatural by saying that warm and fuzzy is God, okay? So religion comes from within man, and truth also comes from within man, okay? But they also claim that man is constantly evolving. Okay, so man started as a lower form of life. Now, another point we should make here is that we're discussing modernism as it was condemned to Pascendi. But actually, it has continued, the era itself has continued to develop, you could say. So we have the writings of Teilhard de Chardin. He took modernism a bit further. So some of what I'm going to say in here is modernism that came from de Chardin, which is a further development. De Chardin said that man started as a lower form of life and will eventually evolve into God. That teaching is implicit in Pascendi, but de Chardin made it explicit. Okay, so man is constantly evolving, and so religion then has to kind of evolve along with him. All right? Now, another point is that truth. Where does truth come from? For a modernist, truth and revelation, they come from the warm fuzzy, but they are made known to man not just by the warm fuzzy, but by his consciousness. Okay, so you have a need for the divine, you have this warm fuzzy, then you become aware of something, become conscious of something, and this consciousness is the divine revelation. Okay, and that consciousness is also the source of the truth. But the consciousness evolves with man. So the truth also is going to evolve with man, okay? And religion then for a modernist, it starts within man, but religion is just an external expression of what man feels within. So for them, all the religions are true, because all the religions can't come from the same place. They come from within man. So maybe they'll say that one religion is more true. Maybe they won't say one religion is more true, but they're going to say they're all true in some way because they all come from the same divine source, all right? Now, but since they believe that man is continuously evolving, and that he's continuously moving towards the higher consciousness. Eventually, again, he'll evolve into God. So he's on his way there right now. But since he is evolving and changing, religion itself must evolve and must change along with him. So for a modernist, change is a sign of life. And for them, life is a sign of truth. Okay? So for a modernist, change is a sign of life because evolution involves change. So change is a sign of life, and life is a sign of truth. This is how Pius X put it. He said, quote, "For the modernists, to live is proof of truth, since for them life and truth are one and the same thing, unquote. Now, since modernists believe that all living things are evolving, like I mentioned, and since evolution involves change, for something to be alive, it must continually change. You see, that which is not changing for a modernist is not alive, and therefore it's not true. And so the result then is that, according to modernists, for religion to remain true, it must be subject to a continuous change, to a continuous updating, to an ongoing aggiornamento. All right?
And we see this all the time when we hear about living documents. If this document's a living document, modernists say that, and what they really mean is that it's open to interpretation and change. But you make a couple excellent points, Rob. Modernism is modern, so today's truth might not be tomorrow's truth. One could say modernists don't even have any real truths. But if modernism, like the devil, is always looking for somebody to devour, how is that? How is it that modernism can kind of lead to this destruction?
Well, you're getting to a deep point that Pius X goes into a little bit later on, but he'll explain that for a religious truth, for a modernist, it's not really true. It's just something that he kind of projects out of himself. So this will bring us to dogma. So we'll get into what the modernists think about dogma here, and then to answer your question, we'll actually get into it later in the encyclical because we could spend a whole episode just on that point that you raised right there. So let's get into
right.
dogma.
Now, how is it, though, that modernism kind of gets into all of us? You and I are even modernists to a certain extent. How is it that it's so subtle and sinister and crafty?
Yeah, another great question, because it contains elements of, there's a number of reasons. One reason that it contains elements of truth, believe it or not. There's things in the modernist system that kind of strike you as maybe that's true. Because, for example, God does speak within man. He does work within man. It's called actual grace. Actual grace does enlighten man to the truth. Remember, actual grace does two things. It enlightens the mind, and it moves the will. So if God does work within me and enlighten my mind, isn't that what modernists say? Don't they say that he's enlightening me within? So it has a certain appearance of truth, but we'll get into that later to show why that's not correct. And as we go through the encyclical, we'll try to point out the grain of truth taught by the modernists, and then how that particular grain of truth is also false, and then we'll show the truth on the other side. So we'll try to do that throughout the encyclical. But what you said, to answer your question, one reason people fall for it is because it has a certain appearance of truth. Also, we're pervaded with modernism. It's the air that we breathe. It's like liberalism. We're surrounded by it, and you can't swim in an ocean of modernism and an ocean of liberalism without getting a little bit wet. So we're all a little bit wet with these errors, which is a good reason we should be studying these encyclicals, because these encyclicals will help us to dry off. It'll help us to see these errors for what they are, so that we can shake off any modernism that we have within us.
That's a really good way to look at it as well. But don't modernists kind of trick us by using Catholic terminology and saying things like you said, sounds right? They might even use real things. Do you have a couple of examples for us?
Yeah, what they do, there's a few different ways. They will, sometimes the less crafty modernists will say things like, we don't believe that anymore. You know, the church used to teach there's no salvation outside the church, but we don't believe that anymore. Okay, at least they're honest by saying what they don't believe. But the more subtle and crafty modernists, the more dangerous modernists, will actually use Catholic terminology, all right, but they'll infuse into it a new meaning, and they won't tell you there's a new meaning infused into it. So they'll talk about the resurrection of the body, but they don't mean the resurrection of the body. They'll talk about no salvation outside the church, but they'll mean something different. Well, we're all members of the church, whether you know it or not. So, sure, there's no salvation outside the church, but now the church is a global, universal thing that's bigger than the church itself. So, yeah, sometimes they'll use the Catholic terminology, but infuse into it a new meaning. So, words have a substance, and words have an accident. People might be familiar with this terminology from the Eucharist. The Eucharist, transubstantiation, is the transformation of the substance of the host into the body of Christ. So the substance changes, the accidents remain the same. The substance is what something is. The accidents are the appearance. Well, words also have a substance and accident. The substance of words are the meaning. The accidents of a word are the words used to convey the meaning, okay? So the substance is the meaning. The accidents are the word, the terminology used to convey the meaning. Well, the modernists have their own false version of transubstantiation. They substitute a new substance and keep the old accident, and they don't tell you about it.
A couple of ones that come glaringly into my mind are freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, because there is a proper Catholic understanding of those, right? But at the same time, modernists have kind of hijacked it.
They infuse into it a new meaning. Those are great examples, because that's exactly right. And some of the real well-known leaders of the hierarchy do this. They use these terminologies, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, but within that there's a new meaning, and that leads to a lot of confusion.
Yeah, well, I'll be talking to somebody who's obviously a modernist, and they don't necessarily mean to be a modernist, but they'll say, well, I have the right to follow my conscience. And so they're not really incorrect. They're just not completely right in understanding what that really means, well-formed conscience. Same thing with freedom of religion. Really, we have the freedom to be Catholic and not have interference from any state, but that doesn't mean what they think it means. I have the freedom to not be Catholic.
Now, let's talk about dogma for a modernist. Dogma for a modernist, remember, everything comes from within man. So the truth comes from within man. He becomes aware. His consciousness becomes aware of something. Then he articulates what he's become aware of, and this articulation of the truth eventually gets the stamp of approval from the magisterium, and that's a dogma. So notice, the dogma came from within man. Man then articulates it. The whole community gets together. They agree on this. He articulates it. The church gives a stamp of approval, and that's a dogma. Now, in reality, the truths have been revealed by God externally, passed down through the church, through the magisterium. The church formulates and proposes truths revealed 2,000 years ago, and those are dogmas. So for the modernists, everything comes from within man. But like we said, since they believe man is continuously evolving to his higher consciousness, then truth itself and the dogmas that express the truth will need to be updated and changed continuously to keep up with man. And that brings us then to the evolution of dogma. Dogma has to change. It has to change to keep up with the time. So dogma has to change to keep up with the time. Religion has to change to keep up with the time. Therefore, novelty, newness is encouraged and embraced by the modernist, while tradition is scorned. Tradition is old, so it's bad. Novelty is new, so it's considered good. So for a modernist, there must be a ongoing, continuous aggiornamento, a continuous updating. Everything must be updated to keep up with modern times. So for a modernist, nothing is worse than someone who holds firmly to religious beliefs of the past. They're holding on to these old past teachings. They're not with the times. But you see where this leads. The end result of modernism is that the true religion, the religion revealed by God, passed down through the church for generations and generations, for hundreds of years, 2,000 years, that religion is abandoned. It's abandoned in place of a new false religion that they believe corresponds to their new higher consciousness. So it's the abandonment of the religion of God and its replacement with the religion of man. So modernism is more than just a heresy. It's an entirely new religion. Pius X called it the synthesis of all the heresies. So take all the heresies, put them all together, and you got modernism. An entirely new and false religion, and a very dangerous religion.
Rob, you made some pretty excellent points. Let's end there with our overview of Pascendi. In our next episode, we'll finally delve into Pascendi paragraphs 1 and 2, maybe paragraph 3, but probably just the first two. If you're following along and listening, I encourage you to follow along through the Papal Encyclical. We use papalencyclicals.net. You can also find it on the Vatican website and several others. It's pretty helpful to read ahead before our episode. It's been interesting. We continue to do our discussion next time.